In 1914, excavators working through the asphalt beds of Los Angeles lifted out a human skull. It had lain in the tar for roughly 10,000 years. One side of the cranium was shattered, and the piece of bone knocked loose was never recovered. She is the only human being ever pulled from these pits. What happened to the fragment of bone that Blow knocked loose, and where did it go? And why, in land the Chumash and Tongva people worked for generations, is she the only one ever found? This was not one unlucky death in a puddle of tar. It was the edge of a 50,000-year record no one has ever closed. What follows weighs a fractured skull against a grinding stone, a supposed burial companion against a radiocarbon date, and a quiet park against one of the densest predator traps documented. Outsiders who first heard of the asphalt seeps at the edge of Los Angeles expected little more than a smelly curiosity, the kind of place that occasionally swallowed a stray cow. Once excavation began in earnest in the early 1900s, museum crews instead uncovered one of the richest fossil deposits on the continent, more than 3,500,000 specimens, representing over 600 species, from a patch of ground barely larger than a city block. But the ratio inside that record was wrong from the very first excavation, and it never corrected itself. In a healthy ecosystem, plant eaters vastly outnumber the predators that hunt them. At the tar pits, something close to 90% of the large mammals recovered were carnivores, wolves, cats, and bears outnumbering their prey by nearly 10-1, a ratio found almost nowhere else in the fossil record. For decades, nobody could fully explain why a death trap would catch so many hunters and so comparatively few of the hunted. That imbalance sat there for the better part of a century, a curiosity belonging entirely to the animals. Then, in that same decade, workers cutting into Pit 10 found something that broke the pattern completely, a human skeleton deliberately positioned, resting beside a smaller set of bones that looked, at first glance, unmistakably canine. For generations, the story told to visitors was simple. A young woman had died near ground her community used for tar, and she had been buried there with her dog beside her, a companion laid to rest with its owner. Then the ordinary explanation collided with the evidence. Radiocarbon dating eventually reached both sets of bones, and the two ages did not match by a little. They were separated by thousands of years. Whatever that dog was doing next to her, it was not what a century of visitors had been told, and the story that closed the case for 100 years reopened at the exact pit where her skull first came out of the ground. If she and the dog were never buried together at all, what actually happened to her? Her name is unknown. Brea woman is only what researchers call her. She died between 17 and 25 years old, standing perhaps 4 feet 8 inches tall. Wear on her teeth shows a diet of stone-ground meal, evidence of grain processing rather than foraging alone. For most of the 20th century, the museum called her North America's first documented homicide victim. That language has softened to unclassified cause of death. A broken grinding stone, of a kind placed with the dead across Southern California, was recovered beside her. Someone who knew her put her there on purpose. If one body was placed there deliberately, what does that say about everything else the tar quietly built for 50,000 years? It says the trap was never a single event, but a machine running for tens of thousands of years, reopening again and again. The mechanism has a name, a predator trap. One herbivore steps into asphalt disguised by dust and leaves. It struggles, and the sound draws in whatever is hunting nearby. Animals that get stuck stealing an easy meal, drawing in still more. Bison bones carry puncture wounds matching predators trapped beside them. The scale is nearly unrepeatable on Earth. More than 4,000 dire wolves have come from this ground alone, more than any other site, and they turn out not to be true wolves at all. More than 2,000 saber-toothed cats have been recovered here, the largest such collection in the world, one so deformed at the hip it could not hunt, yet reached adulthood. 80 American lions and 30 short-faced bears round out a count no other site matches. So if animals were dying here by the thousand, why does the human record around this same trap tell such a different story? Because for the people who lived beside it, the tar was never a mystery. It was a resource they controlled. The Chumash and Tongva used the asphalt for generations, sealing canoes, waterproofing baskets, patching roofs. Cranial features once suggested Chumash ancestry. Later specialists, and tribal leaders themselves, call that reading unverifiable at 9 or 10,000 years old, and no tribe has ever formally claimed her. What is not in dispute is what the wider region holds. A few kilometers away, construction crews uncovered the remains of more than 400 Tongva individuals at one site, an entire community resurfacing at once. Against that number, one deliberate burial here looks less like accident and more like a choice nobody has explained. The story behind Climax 1 begins in 1914, when a crew under paleontologist John C. Merriam cut into what excavators had labeled Pit 10. The notes describe bone fragments consistent with a human cranium and jaw, unusual enough to be set aside and sent for specialist review. By 1918, physical anthropologist Aleś Hrdlička examined the remains and published a report describing a young adult female associating the skeleton tentatively through cranial measurement rather than any artifact with what he and colleague Alfred Kroeber termed probable Chumash affinity. That attribution has followed the case for more than a century, even as later researchers have grown more cautious about what skull shape alone can prove about identity across 10,000 years. The museum's own position hardened that caution into policy. For decades, exhibit text described La Brea woman as North America's first known homicide victim, built around the fracture in her skull. That language has since been formally retired. Curator John Harris has stated on the record that the term now used is unclassified cause of death, acknowledging how little can be proven about a 9,000-year-old injury. Harris has pushed back on the Chumash attribution too, calling it baseless and verifying affiliation this old, in his words, impossible. The grinding stone recovered near the skeleton carries real evidentiary weight. Broken milling stones appear as grave goods across documented Southern California burial traditions, and their presence beside a body is a standard indicator distinguishing deliberate interment from an animal that wandered into the asphalt. Taken together, the excavation notes, Hrdlička's report, and the artifact support what the museum eventually adopted. Someone buried her on purpose. Who that someone was and what killed her remain, in the institution's own phrasing, unresolved. The predator trap number has a specific research history. Taphonomic work on Pit 91 used radiometric dating of dozens of bones to establish deposition happened in at least 2 distinct episodes, one clustering between roughly 45,000 and 35,000 years ago, a second between roughly 26,500 and 23,000 years ago. That finding turned the popular image of a single mass drowning into something closer to the truth, a trap reopening across an enormous span of time. The dog buried beside her received its own re-examination in 2016, when researchers John Harris, Aisling Farrell, and Gary Takeuchi, working with isotope specialists at the University of British Columbia, published new radiocarbon results in Paleo-America. Their dates were unambiguous. The dog measured roughly 3,125 radiocarbon years before present, against roughly 9,080 for the woman, a gap of about 7,000 years. The paper's conclusion dispelled the hypothesis of ceremonial human-dog burial that museum literature had repeated for a century. The animal counts are equally documented. More than 4,000 dire wolves have been catalogued, the largest such collection on Earth, and genetic sequencing published in Nature in 2021, led by researcher Angela Perry, confirmed dire wolves form their own distinct lineage separate from grey wolves, diverging roughly 6 million years earlier with no interbreeding detected since. The Smilodon pelvis was the subject of a 2021 paper in Scientific Reports, led by researcher Miran Balisi with surgeons at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, who used CT imaging to overturn a century-old diagnosis of trauma in favor of congenital hip dysplasia, a defect survivable only with help from others. Museum records confirm at least 80 American lions, more than any other site, and 30 short-faced bears, whose diet here differs from populations elsewhere. Cut marks dated to roughly 15,200 years ago remain the least settled figure here. Sources note a natural cause has not been ruled out. Institutional engagement with the tribal dimension of this case did not happen quickly or quietly. In 2009, forensic artist Melissa Cooper, then a museum volunteer, produced a facial reconstruction of La Brea woman from the recovered skull. When Cooper posted images independently, museum leadership objected, and the reconstruction was withdrawn. Reporting by LA Weekly quoted Barbareño Chumash Council co-chair Deborah Sanchez, stating that the woman's affiliation remained genuinely unknown, she may be Chumash, or from another people entirely, a position consistent with Harris's own statements. Formal consultation followed years later. Under revised federal regulations governing display of Native American cultural material, the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County engaged in structured consultation beginning in 2018 with Tongva representatives, later expanded to Chumash members. That process led directly to the removal of 18 cultural objects from the tar pit's own asphalt and people exhibit, alongside 5 more from a related display, a response driven by tribal consultation rather than any court order. The comparison to Playa Vista comes from public reporting rather than an academic paper. Construction of a large development there, beginning in the early 2000s, uncovered the remains of more than 400 individual Tongva people, a discovery covered by National Public Radio and confirmed by the Gabrieleño Tongva tribal community itself, whose representatives negotiated the reburial directly. No formal claim of cultural affiliation has ever been filed for La Brea woman, not because no tribe has an interest, but because 9 or 10,000 years is, by the government's own evidentiary standard, too old a gap to bridge with certainty. Set beside the written record, the oral and cultural record of the Chumash and Tongva carries its own authority, not as a footnote to the science, but as a parallel account of the same landscape. Both peoples occupied the greater Los Angeles basin and its surrounding coast for thousands of years before any excavator touched Pit 10, and their relationship with the asphalt seeps was practical long before it was symbolic. The Tongva knew their broader homeland, spanning the basin the tar pits sit within, as Tovangar, and their principal village near the heart of present-day Los Angeles as Yanga. This was not empty land waiting to be catalogued, but a named, inhabited world with its own geography of settlements long before any museum existed to excavate it. Early Spanish accounts from the 1760s describe indigenous canoes sealed with the same tar that would later trap saber-toothed cats, watertight enough to carry people between the mainland and the Channel Islands, and asphalt served just as reliably as an adhesive for tools, a waterproofing for baskets, and a sealant for roofs. That kind of working knowledge does not come from distance or fear. It comes from generations of people walking past open asphalt regularly enough to know precisely where it was firm and where it was not, and passing that knowledge down deliberately. Chumash cosmology, as preserved through 20th century ethnographic collections, describes the world as 3 layered realms, a sky world above, the everyday middle world, and a lower world beneath the ground associated with instability, danger, and beings capable of both malevolence and unpredictable power. Earthquakes and other upheavals from below were understood, in that framework, as evidence of what stirred in that lower realm. A patch of ground that bubbles, shifts, and occasionally swallows the living without warning sits naturally inside that cosmology, whether or not any specific surviving story names La Brea by that description. This account does not claim a documented legend naming the tar pits directly. No such text has surfaced in the ethnographic record, and any attempt to invent one would betray the very tradition it claims to honor. What can be said honestly is that the broader Chumash relationship with land, danger, and the world beneath the surface offers a coherent frame for why a community might choose this specific ground deliberately for a burial that had nothing to do with accident. The broken grinding stone recovered beside her fits a documented pattern across many California indigenous burial traditions, in which grave goods were deliberately damaged or ritually killed before being placed with the dead, rather than left whole. That authority extends into the present. When curator John Harris and Barbareño Chumash Council co-chair Deborah Sanchez both describe La Brea woman's affiliation as unresolved, they are not disagreeing about whether her story matters. They are agreeing on the limits of what 9,000 years allows anyone to claim with certainty, scientist and tribal representative alike. Consultation processes that led to the removal of cultural material from the tar pit's own exhibits were driven by that same principle. Descendant communities today do not need a confirmed genetic link to a specific 9,000-year-old skeleton to assert that the ground itself, and everything found within it, deserves more care than a museum case alone can provide. The written record explains how she died only in fragments. The oral and cultural record explains, without any fragment missing, what kind of relationship an entire people had with the ground that took her in, and why that relationship still shapes how her remains are handled today. There is something uncomfortable about a place that can name the birth defect of a single saber-toothed cat, down to the joint, date a dog to within 25 years, and still cannot name the one human being it ever gave back. 50,000 years of death sit beneath a public park in a modern city, catalogued down to the tooth and the puncture wound, and at the center of all that precision is a woman whose community, cause of death, and tribal identity remain, by design, unresolved. Maybe that is simply what a fair record looks like when it refuses to invent what it cannot prove. The predator trap explains the wolves and the bears and the lions because their bones speak in bulk, thousands of examples telling the same story from thousands of angles. One person tells a much thinner story, a grinding stone, a fracture, a missing fragment of bone, and a companion animal that turned out, on closer inspection, to belong to a different century entirely. Sometimes history is a pattern with one deliberate gap in it, and the gap becomes the most honest thing left to study. What the tar could not preserve was intention. It preserved the shattered bone, but not the hand that caused the fracture, if any hand did at all. It preserved her body, but not the reason her community chose this exact ground to lay her down. Every answer this deposit has given has arrived beside a harder question sitting just behind it. That may be the truest thing anyone can say about a 50,000-year archive built entirely out of what refused to let go. Thank you for spending this much time in one small, sticky corner of Ice Age Los Angeles. Stories like this one only come together by weighing excavation records, radiocarbon dates, and the documented accounts of the people who actually lived on this land against each other, rather than settling for whichever version sounds the most dramatic. If that kind of patient, source documentary is what you come here for, consider subscribing, since cases like this are always in progress. Before you go, one question worth sitting with. La Brea woman is the only human being this ground has ever given back, out of 50,000 years and millions of other lives it swallowed first. Every animal here has an explanation now, a mechanism, a number, a name. She still does not. What do you think that one exception was actually for? I will see you in the next documentary.